There is a moment in the oldest human records where the tone changes so completely that it almost feels accidental, as if a scribe paused, dipped his stylus again into wet clay, and continued writing about a different world without explaining why. Before this moment, time behaves strangely. Authority arrives from somewhere above. Rulers do not age as we understand aging. They do not die as men do. After this moment, everything becomes familiar. Lifespans shorten. Cities rise and fall. Kings argue, build, conquer, and are buried. What separates these two modes of existence is not a gradual evolution, but a single line, written with no emphasis, no warning, and no commentary. The line appears in a document most visitors walk past without noticing. A baked clay prism, small enough to hold in both hands, its surface covered in wedge-shaped impressions pressed into soft clay over 4,000 years ago. Modern scholars call it the Sumerian King List, but that title hides how unsettling the document actually is. It does not read like mythology. It does not explain itself. It does not argue. It records. The opening statement is almost casual in its implications. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. There is no metaphorical framing, no poetic flourish. Kingship is treated as a transferable institution, something that can move, arrive, and be located. The text then begins listing rulers in a format that never changes: name, city, length of reign. The list continues in this manner: 8 kings across 5 cities, each ruling for spans of time that defy biological possibility. And then, without transition, without explanation, without even a change in handwriting, the text inserts a single sentence. Then the flood swept over. After that sentence, everything changes. The list does not end. It continues, but the numbers collapse. Kings now reign for hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands. Then for decades. Then for spans historians recognize as plausibly human. Cities mentioned after the flood are places we have excavated. Names recorded after the flood appear in other texts, inscriptions, and genealogies. One of them, Gilgamesh of Uruk, would later become the central figure of the oldest surviving epic poem in human literature. His city walls still exist in the archaeological record. His reign, according to the same list that grants earlier kings impossible longevity, is given as 126 years. This is where the discomfort begins. If the post-flood portion of the document is treated as legitimate history, and it is, because its later sections can be independently verified, then the pre-flood portion presents a problem that modern historiography never fully resolves. The same scribes, using the same bureaucratic language, recorded both sections. The text does not label the first part as symbolic, mythological, or legendary. It does not distinguish between gods and men. It does not mark a change in genre. It simply records a before and an after, divided by a flood. Modern scholarship often explains this away by asserting that ancient people could not clearly separate myth from history. But that assumption sits uneasily with what we know about the culture that produced this text. The Sumerians invented writing specifically for administration. Their earliest tablets are not prayers or stories, but inventories, contracts, and legal decisions. The people who recorded the King List were accountants of reality. They cared deeply about precision, order, and continuity. What makes the boundary so striking is that it is not framed as a beginning. The text does not say civilization was born after the flood. It does not describe a fresh start. It simply continues. Kingship does not emerge after the flood. It resumes. The phrase used implies restoration, not invention. Whatever existed before the flood ended, but the institution it supported carried on in a diminished form. This suggests that the document is not trying to explain how civilization began. It is trying to mark when something stopped. The kings before the flood are not described as heroic founders. They are not given accomplishments. They do not build monuments, fight wars, or issue laws. They simply rule. Their authority appears passive, inherent, unquestioned. The land is under their dominion without explanation. After the flood, rulers must justify themselves. They build walls, dedicate temples, trace lineages, and claim divine favor. Authority becomes something that must be demonstrated rather than assumed. The line, then, is not merely chronological, it is qualitative. On one side of it lies a world where rulership functions as a state of being. On the other lies a world where rulership becomes a performance. The flood marks the transition between these two conditions, but the text offers no moral framing for the catastrophe. There is no condemnation of human behavior, no cleansing narrative, no explanation of divine anger. The flood is treated as an event, not a judgment. This absence of explanation is telling. In later religious traditions, catastrophes are moralized. Disasters become lessons. Here, the flood is simply a boundary. It divides two modes of existence, the way a geological layer divides epochs. Before it, lifespans stretch beyond comprehension. After it, they contract rapidly, generation by generation, until they resemble our own. The list's calm indifference to this transformation is what makes it unsettling. The scribe does not marvel at the ages. He does not express doubt. He does not justify the transition. He records it the way one records the change of seasons. This forces an uncomfortable question to the surface. If this is not the story of humanity discovering civilization, then what is it? Why does the oldest historical document we possess begin by describing a time that does not behave like human history, only to mark its end and continue with something we recognize? The line is easy to miss because it is so unremarkable on the page. A single sentence pressed into clay. No decoration, no emphasis, and yet it separates two entirely different realities. One where kingship descends from heaven and time stretches almost indefinitely, and another where humanity governs itself under constraints that feel painfully familiar. The document does not tell us what existed before the line. It only insists that it did, and it does not tell us who crossed that line. It only records that after the flood, history, as we understand it, began, not as an origin story, as an aftermath. Once you accept that the line exists, that history seems to change its rules at a specific point rather than gradually evolving the figures who stand on the far side of that boundary begin to feel less like legends and more like records of something we no longer know how to categorize. The kings before the flood do not behave like exaggerated humans. They do not act like mythic heroes. They rule in a way that feels fundamentally different from every form of kingship that follows. The document lists them with an almost uncomfortable neutrality. No adjectives, no praise, no moral framing, just names, cities, and lengths of reign. Alulam ruled, Alalga ruled, Enmenluana ruled. The text does not describe how they came to power or what they accomplished while holding it. There is no sense of struggle, no indication of succession crises, no hint of rebellion or conquest. Authority appears static, stable, and uncontested. This is strange, because later kings are never described this way. Even semi-legendary rulers after the flood are defined by what they do. They build walls, they dig canals, they fight enemies, they issue laws. Their legitimacy is constantly asserted, reinforced, and defended. Power becomes something that must be demonstrated publicly and repeatedly. The early kings require none of this. They simply are. Their reigns are not framed as achievements, but as conditions, long stretches of uninterrupted order. The land does not need to be unified, because it already is. The institutions of kingship, priesthood, and city life do not need to be invented, because they already exist. The text does not describe beginnings. It describes continuities. This difference in tone matters. Mythology tends to dramatize origins. Gods create, heroes found cities, monsters are slain so order can emerge. The pre-flood section of the King List does none of this. It opens after kingship has already descended from heaven, implying that the decisive moment happened before the document even begins. The text is not interested in origins, it assumes them. The kings before the flood do not conquer their cities. They are associated with them as if city and ruler are inseparable states. Eridu is not founded, it is already there. Bantibira is not established, it already functions. The relationship between ruler and place feels more like stewardship than domination, more like occupancy than control. Another detail quietly reinforces this difference. The kings before the flood are never described as chosen, beloved, appointed, or favored. Those phrases appear later, in abundance, once kingship becomes human. After the flood, rulers must claim divine backing because it is no longer self-evident. Before the flood, authority needs no explanation. This suggests that whatever these kings were, their legitimacy did not depend on belief. It depended on presence. The text's opening phrase gives a subtle clue. Kingship does not originate with humans, it descends. The implication is not that people imagined authority and projected it upward, but that authority arrived fully formed and was then located in specific cities. Kingship is treated like a transferable system rather than a social experiment. That framing becomes harder to ignore when you consider what the text does not say. It never describes these rulers as gods. It never lists divine titles. They are simply kings, yet they rule 4 spans of time that would require biological conditions utterly unlike our own. The document does not attempt to reconcile this contradiction. It does not explain how they lived so long. It does not justify it symbolically. It records it as fact. This silence is important. When ancient texts invent symbolism, they often signal it. Numbers become round, exaggerated, inconsistent. Stories grow more elaborate with each retelling. But here, the numbers are precise. The structure is rigid. The order of names remains stable across copies made centuries apart. The pre-flood section behaves like something being preserved, not embellished. Even later scribes seem unsure what to do with it. Babylonian copies of the list attempt to reconcile different reign lengths, comparing versions, adjusting totals, but they never remove the pre-flood kings. They never mark them as fictional. The problem for later scribes is not whether these rulers existed. It is how to make sense of the numbers. That tells us something about how ancient people understood their own past. The idea that civilization began with them does not appear to have occurred to them. They did not see themselves as inventors of kingship, writing, or law. They saw themselves as inheritors. The kings before the flood do not legislate because law already exists. They do not organize labor because administration already functions. They do not claim divine favor because authority does not yet need mediation. Their world appears ordered in a way that does not require constant maintenance. After the flood, this changes immediately. Kingship survives, but it behaves differently. Power becomes fragile. Succession becomes contested. Legitimacy becomes something that must be argued, inscribed, and ritually affirmed. The reigns shorten, not abruptly, but progressively, as if something essential is being lost over time rather than destroyed all at once. This gradual collapse of longevity is one of the most unsettling aspects of the record. If the flood were purely symbolic, there would be no need for this slow decline. The text could simply switch from impossibility to normalcy. Instead, it charts a curve, generation by generation, shrinking spans of rule until they align with human biology. That curve feels less like storytelling and more like observation. The kings before the flood are not portrayed as larger-than-life personalities. They are not celebrated. They are not mourned. They are recorded, and that makes them harder to dismiss. They sit in the text like anomalies, quietly insisting that the rules governing early history were not the rules we live under now. If this were mythology, it would glorify them. If it were propaganda, it would justify later rulers by exaggerating earlier ones. Instead, it does something far stranger. It treats an inhuman past as administrative normality and a human present as the continuation of something diminished. The kings did not stop ruling because authority failed. They stopped ruling like this because whatever made that mode of rulership possible was no longer present. And the text does not mourn that loss. It simply moves on. The more time you spend with the early reigns, the harder it becomes to dismiss them as careless exaggeration. If the kings before the flood were invented, then whoever invented them did so with an unusual discipline. The numbers assigned to their reigns do not wander. They do not vary wildly. They do not swell or shrink to suit narrative drama. They obey a rule. That rule becomes visible only when the figures are examined closely. Stripped of the shock they initially produce, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. These are not round numbers meant to impress. They are precise, divisible, patterned. Each one is a clean multiple of 3,600. The largest standard unit of time in the Sumerian numerical system, known as a sar. This matters because the Sumerians did not count the way we do. Their world was organized around base 60. Time, angles, calendars, and astronomical cycles were all measured using this framework. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees in a circle, these are not modern inventions. They are inheritances. In that system, 3,600 is not arbitrary. It is foundational. Every pre-flood reign length in the King List fits neatly into this structure. 8 sar, 10 sar, 12 sar. The totals are tallied with the same care used in economic records. The scribes even calculate the combined length of pre-flood, rule and record it as a single sum. 241,200 years. No approximation, no rounding. This is not how myths usually behave. When cultures invent legendary ages, they tend to favor symbolism over consistency. Numbers drift. They accumulate poetic weight rather than mathematical order. Heroes live 1,000 years, not exactly 12 times a specific unit. Here, the opposite is true. The numbers look less like storytelling and more like accounting. That observation creates a problem because it removes the easiest explanation. If these figures were meant purely as metaphors for greatness or divine favor, there would be no reason to encode them so rigidly. Metaphors do not require internal arithmetic, but administrative systems do. One explanation often offered is that these reigns do not represent individual lifespans at all. Instead, they encode eras, dynasties, or cycles of rule compressed into the names of single kings. The numbers, in this view, are symbolic time blocks rather than biological claims. This interpretation is appealing because it preserves the mathematical order while avoiding the problem of impossible longevity. But it introduces a different question. If these were symbolic eras, why present them as personal reigns with specific names, cities, and sequential order. The text had the vocabulary to describe ages, epochs, and divine cycles. It chose not to use it. Instead, it uses the same format it later applies to kings we know were human. The document never signals a shift in meaning. More unsettling is what happens after the flood. The numerical order collapses. If the pre-flood numbers are symbolic, why does the symbolism stop exactly at the flood boundary? Symbols do not usually obey geological events. Myths do not suddenly abandon their internal logic at a precise transition point shared by multiple cultures. Yet that is exactly what happens here. Mathematical order gives way to biological variability. Precision yields to contingency. The same structure appears elsewhere. In biblical genealogies, lifespans before the flood follow recognizable numerical patterns. Many are clustered around significant values. After the flood, ages declined steadily, generation by generation, losing any obvious numerological symmetry. By the time later figures appear, the numbers look almost random, bounded by human biology rather than symbolic design. Egyptian records show a similar arc. Divine and semi-divine rulers reign for thousands of years. Then, after a poorly explained transition, pharaohs rule for decades. Early rulers claim godhood. Later ones claim only divine favor. The numbers change in the same direction, at the same conceptual boundary. What connects these traditions is not agreement on theology, culture, or language. It is agreement on structure. A long, ordered, mathematically coherent era precedes a rupture. After the rupture, order degrades into variation. This is not how invented legends normally behave. Legends tend to grow more elaborate over time, not more constrained. They inflate rather than collapse. Here, the opposite occurs. The most extraordinary claims are confined to the deepest past, and they are recorded with the greatest precision. The closer the records get to the present, the more mundane and chaotic they become. That inversion suggests that something about the earliest period demanded structure. The numbers do not argue for truth in the modern sense. They do not prove that beings lived for tens of thousands of years, but they strongly suggest that the scribes were not improvising. They were preserving a system whose logic they may not have fully understood, but which they felt compelled to record accurately. This creates an uncomfortable possibility. The pre-flood section of the King List may not be describing human rulers at all. It may be describing a regime governed by different assumptions about time, authority, and life itself. The mathematical regularity hints at a framework where reign length was not measured by aging bodies, but by predefined intervals. After the flood, that framework disappears. Time begins to behave like time again. Bodies decay. Authority must be justified. Numbers lose their elegance. History becomes noisy, irregular, and recognizably human. The transition is not framed as progress. It is framed as loss. And the numbers, in their quiet insistence on order before chaos, refuse to let that loss be dismissed as imagination. Once the numerical order collapses, the text does something even more unsettling. It does not explain why. The flood is not framed as a moral reckoning, nor as the climax of a story. It is inserted like a technical marker, a dividing line between two incompatible conditions. Then the flood swept over. No adjectives, no drama, no attempt to describe suffering, destruction, or survival. The sentence functions less like a narrative and more like a timestamp. This is where the document diverges sharply from the way later cultures would retell catastrophe. In myth, disasters are justified. They cleanse corruption, punish arrogance, or reset the moral balance of the world. Here, the flood is treated as an interruption. Something happened, and afterward, the rules changed. What makes this interpretation difficult to ignore is how consistently that change appears across different systems within the same text. Lifespans shorten, reign lengths shrink, authority shifts from inherent to contested, language changes. The flood is not just a watery event. It marks a transition in how reality itself is organized. The text does not claim that the gods died in the flood. Temples continue to function afterward. Rituals persist. Prayers are still offered, but something essential is missing. Kingship no longer descends from heaven. It moves horizontally, from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, through inheritance and conquest. The vertical axis is gone. This shift appears subtle on the page, but its implications are enormous. Before the flood, authority arrives from outside the human system. After the flood, authority must be generated, defended, and maintained within it. The flood marks the moment when governance becomes human. What is striking is how little attention the text pays to the flood itself. There is no description of the waters, no account of survival, no named hero who builds a vessel. Those stories exist elsewhere, in epics and later retellings, but here, in what functions as a master chronological record, the flood is reduced to a boundary condition. It is not the story. It is the divider. This suggests that the scribes were not interested in the drama of catastrophe. They were interested in its consequences. After the flood, kingship is described as being brought down again to certain cities. The phrasing implies recovery rather than creation. The institution survives, but it does so in a weakened form. The extraordinary longevity of rulers does not vanish instantly, it decays. Early post-flood kings still reign for centuries, as if something is slowly wearing off rather than being abruptly removed. This gradual decline matters. It implies continuity rather than replacement. Whatever existed before the flood did not disappear completely. Its effects lingered, fading over generations. This is not how symbolic storytelling usually works. Symbolic transitions are clean. They favor clear breaks. This one does not. The same pattern appears in other ancient chronologies. Before a great rupture, beings live extraordinarily long lives. After it, lifespans contract, but not immediately to modern norms. The decline follows a curve. Each generation lives less than the previous one. The change feels biological rather than theological. That biological flavor is difficult to reconcile with purely metaphorical explanations. If the flood was simply a narrative device separating mythic time from historical time, there would be no need to chart such a careful regression. The text could simply say, from this point on, humans lived as we do now. Instead, it preserves the slope of loss. This suggests that the flood marks not just an ending, but a withdrawal. Something that once sustained extraordinary conditions stopped doing so, not violently, not with finality, but decisively enough that the system began to fail. The flood becomes less a punishment and more a closure event, the moment when direct maintenance ceased. Later traditions would struggle with this idea. They would reinterpret the flood as cleansing, judgment, or renewal because the alternative is unsettling. If the flood marks withdrawal rather than rebirth, then humanity's story begins not with divine generosity but with abandonment. The King List does not argue this point. It does not need to. It simply places the flood between two incompatible realities and lets the contrast speak for itself. Before it, rulers exist in a world of mathematical order, extended time, and unquestioned authority. After it, history becomes recognizable, fragile, and uncertain. This is why the flood functions so powerfully in ancient chronology. It is not just an event to be remembered. It is a line that must be crossed to explain why the world no longer works the way it once did. The document does not tell us what caused the flood. It does not assign blame. It does not offer comfort. It records the moment when something that had governed the world stepped away, leaving behind institutions that could continue only by adapting to human limits. History, as we know it, begins not when civilization is born, but when the conditions that made another kind of civilization possible are removed. If the flood marks a boundary in time, its effects are not confined to king lists and reign lengths. They appear in stone, in mud brick, and in the silent geometry of the earliest cities themselves. When archaeologists began excavating the deepest layers of southern Mesopotamia, they expected to find gradual beginnings. Villages growing into towns, towns experimenting with organization, early attempts, mistakes, corrections. What they found instead was something far less comfortable. At sites like Eridu, the earliest occupation layers do not look experimental. From the very bottom, the city is already structured around a central sacred complex. Residential zones, administrative areas, and ritual spaces are clearly defined. Streets are aligned. Construction follows consistent principles. The city does not feel like it is learning how to be a city. It feels like it has inherited a plan. This pattern repeats. Uruk emerges in the archaeological record not as a sprawling village that slowly organizes itself, but as an urban system already capable of supporting tens of thousands of people. Large-scale construction appears early. Monumental architecture is present almost from the start. There is no clear sequence of trial and error leading up to it. Standard historical models explain this by proposing missing precursors. Somewhere else, it is assumed, urbanism developed earlier and then spread into Mesopotamia. But that somewhere else remains elusive. No older urban prototypes have been found that convincingly explain the sudden competence of these early cities. Instead of diffusion, the evidence suggests appearance. The same unease follows the earliest temples. At Eridu, archaeologists uncovered a sequence of shrines stacked one atop another, reaching back to the 6th millennium BCE. The oldest temple in the sequence is smaller, but it is not crude. Its walls are straight. Its layout is intentional. The orientation is precise. Each subsequent temple rebuilds the same basic design, as if following a template rather than innovating. This is not how human learning curves usually look. When technologies or social systems are invented, early versions tend to be awkward. They show uncertainty. They vary wildly. Over time, efficiency improves. Here, efficiency is present from the beginning. Later developments add scale and decoration, but not fundamentally new ideas. Writing shows the same pattern. The earliest tablets from Uruk are not poetic expressions or religious hymns. They are administrative records. They track rations, labor assignments, and resource distribution. The writing system appears already capable of abstraction, categorization, and numerical calculation. It is not learning to write. It is using writing. Within a remarkably short span, this system evolves into full cuneiform, capable of recording laws, literature, and complex theology. The speed of this transition troubles linguists because it compresses what is usually a centuries-long developmental process into a few generations. There are no clear transitional stages preserved in the archaeological record. The system does not crawl. It arrives walking. What follows is even stranger. After this early burst of sophistication, progress slows. Writing stabilizes. Urban planning becomes conservative. Administrative systems persist with minor refinements, but no radical redesign. For nearly 2,000 years, Mesopotamian civilization operates within frameworks that appear to have been established at the very beginning. This is the opposite of what we would expect if these systems were being invented from scratch. Innovation usually accelerates as knowledge accumulates. Here, it plateaus. The civilization spends centuries maintaining, standardizing, and preserving rather than radically transforming its foundational structures. This pattern suggests inheritance. It feels as though the earliest generations after the flood were not creating institutions, but learning how to operate ones that already existed. They copied forms. They rebuilt temples on the same footprints. They used numerical systems whose logic they accepted without question. Over time, as understanding faded, changes became cautious and incremental. The language of early texts reinforces this impression. Cities are rarely described as being founded. They are described as being where kingship resides. Temples are not inaugurated. They are restored. Administrative roles are not invented. They are assumed. The past is treated not as a blank slate, but as a reference point. Even myths reflect this orientation. Creation stories focus on organization rather than invention. The world already exists. Humans are assigned roles within it. Social order is not created. It is maintained. Disruption is framed as deviation from an earlier balance, not as a failure to achieve one. This is why the flood boundary matters so deeply. It aligns not just with changes in lifespan and kingship, but with a shift in cultural confidence. Before the boundary, systems appear complete and unquestioned. After it, they are preserved anxiously, rebuilt repeatedly, and justified through ritual and myth. The earliest cities do not feel like experiments. They feel like installations. And the people who lived in them behave like caretakers rather than architects of civilization. If this impression is correct, then early human history did not begin with invention. It began with adaptation. Humanity stepped into a world where the structures of complex life were already present, functioning, and demanding upkeep. The task was not to design them, but to keep them running under new constraints. Civilization, in this light, does not rise, it settles. The sense of inheritance becomes harder to ignore when we move away from cities and stones and look instead at what early civilizations knew. Not what they believed, but what they calculated, measured, and administered. Knowledge leaves a different kind of trace, one that is less forgiving of improvisation. And here, too, the earliest records feel uncomfortably complete. The numerical system used in the earliest Mesopotamian tablets is not simple. It is not intuitive. It is not the kind of counting method a society stumbles into while learning how to trade. It is a fully articulated sexagesimal system based on 60, capable of expressing fractions, ratios, and complex relationships with ease. This system is already present in the earliest mathematical texts we possess. There is no evidence of a simpler precursor, no base 10 phase, no experimental stage. Base 60 is not an obvious choice. It requires abstraction. It requires understanding that numbers can be broken into multiple divisors and recombined flexibly. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That makes it extraordinarily powerful for astronomy, geometry, and timekeeping. It is a system designed, not discovered by accident. What makes this unsettling is how early it appears. The oldest mathematical tablets already assume this framework. They do not explain it, they use it. Problems involve area calculations, grain distribution, and labor quotas that require confidence in the system's reliability. The scribes are not testing ideas, they are applying rules. Within a relatively short time, these same traditions produce texts that solve quadratic equations, calculate square roots, and use geometric relationships later attributed to much later thinkers. The mathematics is not primitive. It is competent, systematic, and quietly ambitious. Then something curious happens. The mathematics does not dramatically improve. For centuries, later cultures used the same techniques. They refine notation, they expand tables, but the foundational concepts remain unchanged. The system plateaus. Innovation slows. Knowledge is preserved rather than revolutionized. The tools remain effective, but their origins recede into tradition. Astronomy follows the same pattern. Early Babylonian texts track planetary movements with a precision that astonishes modern historians. Venus cycles are recorded accurately over long spans of time. Eclipse patterns are recognized and predicted. The observations imply continuous record-keeping across generations, far longer than any individual scholar's lifetime. Yet the texts themselves insist that this knowledge is inherited. Astronomical tablets from much later periods refer explicitly to older records and ancient observations. They do not present themselves as breakthroughs. They present themselves as interpretations of a legacy. The problem is that those older records are missing. If the knowledge was developed gradually, where are the centuries of trial and error that must have preceded it? Where are the flawed models, the abandoned hypotheses, the intermediate steps? In most fields of human learning, these traces accumulate. Here they are absent. Law tells a similar story. The earliest surviving legal code, attributed to Code of Yuanamu, does not read like a first attempt at justice. It distinguishes between intentional and accidental harm. It establishes proportional punishment. It recognizes different legal statuses within society. These concepts usually require long philosophical development. They do not emerge fully formed. The code itself implies precedent. It refers to established practices and earlier judgments, suggesting that even at this early date, law was already old. Once again, the structure appears before its history. Architecture reinforces the pattern. Monumental construction at sites like Göbekli Tepe, dating to a period before agriculture, is supposed to be widespread. Displays sophisticated planning, symbolic coherence, and technical skill. Massive stone pillars are arranged with precision. Carvings show consistent iconography. There are no practice versions, no crude drafts. Later architecture builds on these principles rather than reinventing them. Scale increases. Ornamentation becomes more elaborate, but the core engineering logic does not change. The earliest examples are already competent. What ties these domains together is not brilliance, but timing. Knowledge appears early, fully functional, and then enters a long phase of maintenance. This is not the trajectory of discovery. It is the trajectory of stewardship. If humanity were inventing civilization from scratch, we would expect accelerating innovation. Each generation would build rapidly on the last. Instead, we see an initial burst of capability followed by slow, careful preservation. Progress becomes incremental. Knowledge is treated as something to be guarded rather than expanded. This pattern aligns disturbingly well with the flood boundary. The earliest post-flood generations seem to possess tools and systems they did not design. They use them effectively, but they do not significantly alter their foundations. Over time, understanding thins. Techniques become ritualized. Practices are followed because they are traditional, not because their logic is fully grasped. The language of later texts reflects this. Instructions become more detailed, not because tasks are more complex, but because certainty has diminished. Rituals multiply steps. Calculations are codified. Commentary expands. These are signs of systems being maintained by rules rather than intuition. It is here that the idea of disappearance begins to feel less metaphorical. Knowledge does not behave as though it is being discovered. It behaves as though it is being remembered imperfectly. The earliest generations operate confidently within inherited frameworks. Later ones rely increasingly on manuals, tables, and interpretive traditions. If something had once explained these systems directly, its absence would produce exactly this outcome. The structures would remain, the instructions would persist, but the deeper understanding would erode. Knowledge that arrives before its time does not vanish overnight. It fades, it becomes tradition, it becomes sacred, it becomes unquestionable, and eventually it becomes mysterious. If knowledge behaves like something inherited and slowly eroded, religion reveals where that erosion was felt most sharply. The earliest texts do not describe humans reaching upward, guessing at divine will, or anxiously interpreting signs. They describe conversation. Commands are issued. Instructions are given. Decisions are made in language that feels immediate, unmediated, and unambiguous. In the oldest Sumerian narratives, the gods speak plainly. They tell humans where to build, when to act, and what will happen next. The grammar is direct. Verbs appear in the imperative. There is no need for priests to decode meaning because meaning is stated. When catastrophe approaches, warnings are explicit. When order must be restored, instructions are detailed. Divine authority does not require interpretation because it is present. This changes after the flood boundary, and the change is subtle enough that it is easy to miss if you are not looking for it. The gods do not vanish from the texts. Their names continue to appear. Temples remain active. Ritual calendars are preserved. But the manner of communication shifts. Gods no longer give instructions. They give signs. Instead of speech, there are omens. Instead of commands, there are portents. Instead of dialogue, there is divination. This shift is not announced. No text says, from this point on, the gods will no longer speak directly. It is simply reflected in how religious practice evolves. The earliest records describe gods walking among cities, inspecting temples, and intervening in practical affairs. Later records describe priests watching the flight of birds, examining the livers of sacrificial animals, or interpreting dreams whose meaning is never obvious. Divination manuals begin to proliferate. Entire professions emerge dedicated to reading signs. Specialists memorize thousands of possible configurations and their supposed meanings. The complexity of these systems increases over time, not because divine will has become more nuanced, but because access to it has become less clear. This is an important distinction. When communication degrades, interpretation expands, noise increases, signal becomes indirect. The historical record reflects exactly this pattern. Early religious texts are short, direct, and confident. Later ones are longer, conditional, and cautious. Phrases like, if the god accepts, and should the goddess be pleased, begin to appear. Uncertainty enters sacred language. The architecture of temples mirrors this change. The earliest sanctuaries are not designed for large congregations. They are compact, inward-facing spaces with raised platforms, often interpreted as seats or resting places for the deity. These buildings feel like residences rather than theaters. They are meant to house presence, not performance. Over time, temples expand. Processional pathways appear. Storage rooms multiply. Public courtyards grow larger. The focus shifts from hosting a god to hosting rituals about a god. The ziggurat, with its layered terraces and ceremonial ascent, is not designed for a deity who arrives unannounced and gives orders. It is designed for priests who must invoke attention through elaborate procedure. The priesthood itself changes. Early texts describe figures who dwell with the god, attendants rather than intermediaries. Later periods fragment religious roles into specialized functions. Some priests interpret dreams. Others read omens. Others maintain ritual purity. Others record observations. This bureaucratization of the sacred makes little sense if divine communication remains clear. It makes perfect sense if it does not. What is striking is that later religious authorities insist nothing has changed. Rituals are performed as they always have been. Liturgies preserve archaic language no longer fully understood. Phrases are repeated because they are ancient, not because their meaning is clear. Tradition becomes a substitute for presence. The gods are still believed to be there. Their absence is never openly acknowledged. Instead, religious systems grow increasingly complex in an attempt to bridge a gap that is never named. The louder the silence, the more elaborate the effort to interpret it. This pattern appears consistently. When early texts describe divine decision-making, it is immediate. When later texts describe it, it is inferred. When gods once said, "Do this," they later indicate through signs that may or may not be correctly read. Responsibility shifts quietly from divine command to human judgment, even as that shift is denied. This has consequences beyond theology. Political authority becomes less certain. Kings rely on priests to validate decisions. Omens are consulted before wars. Dreams are interpreted to justify policy. The divine no longer governs directly. It advises ambiguously. The flood boundary aligns precisely with this transition. Before it, God's rule. After it, God's sanction. The difference may seem subtle, but it transforms how societies function. Direct authority produces stability. Mediated authority produces negotiation, anxiety, and institutional growth. The texts never say that the gods left. They do not need to. Their absence is encoded in procedure. It is written into the growing complexity of ritual, the multiplication of interpretive systems, and the conditional language of later prayers. If the gods had always been silent, there would be no reason to invent such elaborate methods of listening. Silence would be normal, but these systems appear as replacements, not foundations. They behave like technologies developed to compensate for something lost. The most revealing detail is how later texts describe the past. They speak of a time when the gods dwelt among us. The phrase is always in the past tense. It is treated as a given, not a metaphor. No explanation is offered for why that time ended. It simply did. This refusal to name the absence is perhaps the most human response imaginable. To admit that the source of authority has withdrawn would destabilize everything built upon it. Instead, societies construct rituals, myths, and institutions that assume the presence continues, even as evidence accumulates that it does not. The silence after direct command is not empty. It is filled with effort. It is filled with interpretation. It is filled with structures designed to maintain a relationship that has changed fundamentally. And in that silence, history begins to sound less like the story of humanity discovering the gods, and more like the story of humanity learning how to function when the voice it once followed no longer answers. Among all the figures who stand near the flood boundary, one of them feels less like a symbol and more like a witness. He appears late enough to be historically traceable, yet early enough to belong to a world that still remembers what came before. His name sits quietly in the same king list that records impossible reigns, and it is written with the same administrative indifference. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, ruled for 126 years. That number is telling. It is long by human standards, but it is not extraordinary in the way pre-flood reigns are. Gilgamesh stands at the threshold where the old rules no longer fully apply. He is not immortal. He is not ordinary. He is something in between. Later, literature would describe him as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His mother is named as a goddess. His father is a mortal king. The text does not treat this parentage as metaphor. It uses the same grammatical markers used elsewhere to distinguish gods from humans. Gilgamesh is a hybrid, a category that should not exist if the world operates solely on human terms. This makes his story more than an adventure. It becomes a record of transition. The epic that bears his name begins not with his fear of death, but with his confrontation with it. When his companion Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is not merely grieving, he is confused. The language of the text is explicit. He looks at his friend's body and asks whether the same fate awaits him. This is not a philosophical question. It is a biological one. For someone of Gilgamesh's lineage, death should not be inevitable. His ancestors in the King List lived for centuries. The rulers before them lived for millennia. Immortality, or something close to it, should still be accessible. Yet Enkidu dies completely, reduced to dust like any ordinary man. Something Gilgamesh expected to persist has failed. His quest is often interpreted as a universal human fear of mortality, but that reading flattens the story. Gilgamesh is not seeking immortality because humans cannot accept death. He is seeking it because he knows it once existed. He is not chasing a fantasy. He is trying to reclaim an inheritance. The path he takes reinforces this interpretation. Every stage of his journey moves him further from the familiar world and closer to something that feels deliberately sealed off. He passes through regions guarded by beings described as neither human nor divine, remnants of an earlier order. They recognize him. They do not recognize ordinary humans. His partial divinity grants him passage where others would be turned away. He travels through darkness measured in leagues, not hours. The text emphasizes duration rather than distance, as if he is crossing not just space but a boundary in time. He reaches the waters of death, a domain so hostile that touching it means annihilation. The precautions required to cross it are precise and mechanical, more like instructions for navigating a dangerous system than mythic symbolism. At the end of this journey, he finds Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood. This encounter is often framed as a meeting between hero and sage, but the dialogue tells a different story. Utnapishtim does not greet Gilgamesh as a seeker of wisdom. He observes him clinically. He notices that Gilgamesh is aging, his face is worn, his strength is failing. Utnapishtim understands what Gilgamesh has not yet fully accepted. Whatever granted immortality before the flood is no longer available. Utnapishtim did not earn eternal life through virtue. He was granted it as an exception, a compensation for surviving a catastrophe the gods themselves regretted. And immediately after receiving it, he was removed from the human world. Immortality, the text implies, was never meant to persist in the post-flood order. The test Utnapishtim gives Gilgamesh is deceptively simple. Stay awake for 7 days. Gilgamesh fails almost immediately. This is not a moral failure, it is physiological. Sleep is described elsewhere in ancient thought as a little death, a daily surrender of consciousness. Gilgamesh cannot resist it because his body no longer supports the conditions required for unbroken awareness. The test demonstrates incompatibility, not unworthiness. When Gilgamesh is offered the plant that restores youth, his response is revealing. He does not consume it immediately. He plans to test it. He intends to apply it methodically, like recovered technology rather than magic. The plant works. A serpent consumes it and sheds its skin, visibly rejuvenated. The mechanism is real, but it is lost. The door closes quietly. No curse is pronounced. No punishment is issued. The world simply no longer supports what Gilgamesh seeks. When he returns to Uruk, the epic shifts its focus. It lingers on the city walls he built, structures meant to endure beyond his shortened lifespan. The message is subtle but decisive. The age when beings like Gilgamesh could reclaim the old order is over. Even those with divine blood are subject to the new limits. The past is not forbidden. It is inaccessible. Gilgamesh becomes the first ruler to accept this condition consciously. He does not reopen the door. He does not restore immortality. He builds within constraint. His story marks the moment when humanity stops trying to return and begins learning how to remain. Once the door closes for Gilgamesh, the record does not erupt into despair. It settles. Kings continue to rule. Cities continue to function. Laws are written, taxes collected, temples maintained. Civilization does not collapse when the old order withdraws. It adapts. But the nature of authority changes so completely that later rulers seem almost haunted by what they are no longer able to be. Post-flood kingship is defined by justification. Where earlier rulers simply occupied authority, later ones must explain it. Inscriptions grow longer. Genealogies become more elaborate. Titles multiply. Kings describe themselves as chosen, beloved, appointed, favored. The language of rulership becomes defensive, as if power now requires argument rather than presence. This is not a sign of growing sophistication. It is a sign of uncertainty. Legal codes make this shift visible in stone. The earliest laws do not claim to invent justice. They claim to restore it. They present themselves as corrections to disorder rather than creations of order. When kings inscribe law, they do so beneath images of gods, receiving symbols of authority they must interpret and apply. The divine no longer governs directly. It authorizes from a distance. This mediated authority reaches a clear expression in the famous law stele associated with Code of Hammurabi. The image shows a human king standing before a seated god, not as an equal, not as an incarnation, but as a recipient. The laws that follow are enforced by human courts, human officials, and human penalties. Divine presence legitimizes the system, but it does not operate it. This is a fundamental difference from the world implied by the pre-flood record. Their authority does not appear delegated. It appears inherent. After the flood, everything is delegated. Kings rule, but only within constraints they did not design. Laws function, but only because humans enforce them. Order persists, but it requires constant maintenance. The rhetoric of rulership reflects this tension. Kings emphasize restoration. They claim to bring back ancient justice, ancient balance, ancient ways. They speak of repairing what has fallen into disarray. Rarely do they claim to innovate. Innovation carries risk. Tradition carries legitimacy. This obsession with the past is telling. Societies confident in their authority do not need to anchor themselves so aggressively to earlier models. Post-flood civilizations do. They frame every act of governance as continuity with something older and greater. Even administrative systems show this conservatism. Accounting methods, measurement standards, and bureaucratic roles persist for centuries with minimal alteration. When change occurs, it is incremental and cautious. The machinery of civilization feels inherited, like equipment passed down without a full manual. The same pattern appears outside Mesopotamia. Egyptian pharaohs frame their reigns as restorations of the first time, a mythical era when divine order was directly present. Chinese rulers speak of the mandate of heaven as something received, not created. Authority everywhere is treated as borrowed. What is absent is the confidence of origin. No post-flood king claims to establish kingship itself. No lawgiver claims to invent justice. No priest claims to create ritual from nothing. They claim to preserve, interpret, and uphold. The role of leadership becomes custodial. This custodianship extends even to failure. When disasters occur, kings consult omens. They search for signs that they have misinterpreted the will of higher powers. Responsibility becomes shared, ambiguous, deferred. Authority without direct guidance produces anxiety, and anxiety produces institutions. The proliferation of bureaucracy, priesthood, and legalism is often treated as progress. In this context, it reads as compensation. These systems exist because something simpler no longer works. Direct command has been replaced by procedure. Presence has been replaced by protocol. The world after the flood is not godless. It is supervised at a distance. Humans are allowed to rule, but only within frameworks that constantly remind them of what they are not. Kings may sit on thrones, but they do so under symbols of authority that are not their own. This creates a subtle psychological shift. Rulers become managers of inherited systems rather than embodiments of power. Their legitimacy rests not on who they are, but on how well they perform a role defined long before they arrived. Success is measured by stability, not transformation. The records preserve this shift without commentary. They do not lament the loss, they adapt to it, and in doing so, they reveal something unexpected. Civilization does not begin when gods withdraw, it becomes self-conscious. From this point on, history is no longer about beings who rule by nature. It is about humans who rule by permission, memory, and maintenance. Authority persists, but it carries the faint echo of something that once required no explanation. The systems work, the cities endure, but the tone of history changes. It becomes quieter, heavier, and unmistakably human. When the records finally grow quiet, they do not end with catastrophe. They end with continuation. Temples remain standing, cities remain inhabited, kings continue to rule. Rituals are still performed at the correct times, in the correct language, following instructions whose origins lie far beyond living memory. On the surface, nothing has broken, and yet everything feels different. What the oldest chronicles insist on, without ever stating directly, is that history did not begin with an awakening. It began with an adjustment. Humanity did not step forward into civilization. It stepped into responsibility. The earliest texts do not describe humans inventing order. They describe humans inheriting it. They speak of systems already in place, knowledge already structured, authority already defined. And then they record the moment when that framework stops renewing itself, not with violence, not with collapse, but with withdrawal. Presence becomes absence. The flood, in this light, is not a story about cleansing or punishment. It is a line drawn under an arrangement that no longer continues. After it, no gods rule directly. No kings possess inherent authority. No beings live for millennia. What remains is a world that still functions, but now demands effort. This explains the strange emotional tone of early human history. There is reverence, but also anxiety. There is confidence in tradition, but fear of deviation. There is an obsession with restoring what once was, even when no one can clearly describe it anymore. civilization becomes an act of maintenance. Every later culture seems to know this instinctively. They all preserve memories of a time when guidance was direct and life was longer. They all mark a boundary where that time ends. They all construct elaborate systems to compensate for its absence. And none of them ever say plainly that the ones who ruled before are gone, because to say it out loud would change everything. Instead, the absence is woven into law codes, rituals, architecture, and myths. It becomes the unspoken assumption beneath human effort. The reason kings justify themselves, the reason priests interpret signs, the reason knowledge is guarded like something fragile, the reason history feels like stewardship rather than ascent. If this reading is even partially correct, then human history is not the story of becoming civilized. It is the story of learning how to operate civilization alone, of keeping systems running without the hands that designed them, of accepting limits where once there were none. And perhaps that is why the records never end with despair. They end with walls being built, with laws being written, with cities enduring. Mortality replaces immortality, but permanence does not vanish. It changes form. It moves from bodies into structures, from rulers into institutions, from presence into memory. The gods do not return. The door remains closed, but humanity does not stop. History continues, quieter now, slower, more uncertain, shaped by absence rather than command. And in that long silence, after the voices fade, something distinctly human takes shape. Not divinity, responsibility.